Right now, in the northwestern desert of Saudi Arabia, something extraordinary and possibly catastrophic is happening simultaneously. Heavy machinery is carving foundations into sand that hasn't been disturbed in millennia. Thousands of construction workers are driving steel piles deep into bedrock. Satellites orbiting overhead are capturing images of excavations stretching for kilometers across terrain that was empty wilderness just months ago. But here's what makes this story genuinely unsettling. The project these workers are building has already been secretly downsized by over 98% from its original vision, and most of them probably don't even know it yet. What was announced to the world as a revolutionary 170-kilometer linear city housing 9 million people has been quietly reduced to a 2.4-kilometer fragment expected to house just 300,000. And even that scaled-back target is looking increasingly questionable as costs spiral and timelines slip. This is the story of the line, the centerpiece of Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030, and it represents either the most ambitious urban planning project in human history or the most spectacular case of architectural hubris ever attempted. The truth is probably somewhere between those extremes, but watching this unfold in real time reveals something profound about the gap between visionary ideas and practical reality, about what happens when unlimited budgets meet the stubborn constraints of physics and engineering, and about whether humanity is ready to fundamentally reimagine how cities work, or if we're just building extremely expensive monuments to concepts that sound revolutionary in presentations but collapse under the weight of implementation. Let's start with what the line was supposed to be, because the original vision was genuinely unlike anything humans have ever attempted in urban planning. Imagine a single continuous building stretching 170 kilometers across desert terrain. That's roughly the distance from Los Angeles to San Diego, compressed into a structure just 200 meters wide but 500 meters tall. The entire city would be enclosed within two parallel mirrored walls, creating a narrow vertical corridor where 9 million people would live in stacked neighborhoods with everything they need: homes, schools, shops, offices, parks, accessible within a 5-minute walk. There would be no cars because there would be no roads. Instead, a high-speed rail system buried beneath the structure would transport residents from one end to the other in just 20 minutes, moving at speeds that would make conventional subway systems look prehistoric. The exterior would be entirely mirrored glass, reflecting the desert landscape and theoretically minimizing visual impact, while creating one of the most striking architectural statements ever built. It was urban planning as radical experiment. What if we compressed sprawling horizontal cities into compact vertical communities, eliminated transportation infrastructure entirely, and built something that looked more like a mega structure from science fiction than a traditional metropolitan area? When this vision was first revealed to global media, reactions ranged from awe at the ambition to immediate skepticism about feasibility. Could you actually build a structure 170 kilometers long? Would people want to live in a narrow corridor with no traditional streets or outdoor spaces? How would emergency services function? What happens if the high-speed rail breaks down? The questions were endless, but Saudi Arabia's leadership projected absolute confidence. This wasn't just architectural fantasy. This was Vision 2030, the kingdom's comprehensive plan to diversify away from oil dependency by becoming a global hub for tourism, technology, and innovative urban living. The line was positioned as the centerpiece of this transformation, the project that would prove Saudi Arabia could lead the world into a new era of urban design. The budget was essentially unlimited, backed by the kingdom's massive sovereign wealth fund. The timeline was aggressive but supposedly achievable. Construction began with enormous fanfare and thousands of workers deployed to the desert site. Then reality started asserting itself in ways that couldn't be ignored or papered over with optimistic projections. In early 2024, internal documents leaked to the Financial Times revealed what had been carefully hidden from public view. The line had been dramatically scaled back in ways that fundamentally altered what was being built. Instead of completing the full 170-kilometer span by 2030, the revised internal target was just 2.4 kilometers. That's not a minor adjustment or phased approach. That's reducing the project to approximately 1.4% of its originally announced scale. The population target collapsed proportionally, dropping from 1.5 million residents by 2030 to just 300,000. But even that reduced figure was described by people familiar with the project as optimistic given current construction pace and the absence of supporting infrastructure. Satellite imagery confirmed what the leaked documents suggested. Instead of a continuous mirrored wall slicing across the desert, as dramatic renderings had shown, construction appeared fragmented and disconnected. Concrete cores were scattered in isolated clusters separated by empty ground. Foundation pits had been excavated, but many remained untouched by any subsequent construction. A few isolated stretches of mirrored facade had been installed, but the vast majority of the site consisted of raw concrete, exposed steel, and excavation zones that didn't obviously connect to any coherent structure. So what actually went wrong? The challenges fall into several categories that compounded each other in ways that made the original vision increasingly untenable. Start with terrain and engineering. The proposed 170-kilometer route crosses dramatically different environments: flat desert expanses, rocky plateaus with difficult geology, and fragile coastal wetlands that present environmental and construction complications. Building a continuous structure across such varied terrain requires solving fundamentally different engineering problems every few kilometers, each adding cost and complexity. The foundation work alone became one of the most challenging aspects. To keep construction sites stable in sandy desert conditions, engineers installed sprawling dewatering systems with hundreds of wells and sensors pumping continuously to hold back groundwater that would otherwise destabilize excavations. Thousands of piles had to be driven deep into bedrock to create stable foundations capable of supporting structures 500 meters tall. This became what multiple sources described as the biggest foundation project anywhere in the world. And foundation work is typically the most expensive and time-consuming phase of any construction project, consuming budgets before any visible progress appears above ground. Cost escalation became the second major problem. The line is technically part of NEOM, a broader $1.5 trillion regional development funded by Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund. Initial projections suggested the line would consume a substantial but manageable portion of that budget, but by 2023, independent analysts were estimating the line alone would require over $1 trillion in development costs, meaning this single project would consume two-thirds of the entire NEOM budget, leaving insufficient funding for the numerous other projects that were supposed to transform the region simultaneously. As expenses climbed far beyond original projections, the Saudi government quietly began redirecting funding toward other NEOM projects that seemed more achievable and offered clearer value propositions. Trojena, a luxury mountain ski resort in the desert that was confirmed to host the 2029 Asian Winter Games. Sindalah, a Red Sea island that actually opened to tourists in October 2024. And Oxagon, a floating industrial city positioned near major shipping routes. The line, once positioned as the undisputed centerpiece of Vision 2030, suddenly found itself competing for resources with projects that were progressing more smoothly and generating actual revenue. What's actually being constructed today bears little resemblance to the revolutionary vision presented in slick marketing videos. Instead of a continuous 170-kilometer mirrored wall, the focus has shifted to what's being called a pilot zone, a roughly 2.4-kilometer stretch composed of isolated modules and test structures. There's no visible high-speed rail system, which was supposed to be integral to the entire concept of how residents would move through the city. The signature vertical zoning system, where communities would be stacked on top of each other with all amenities within 5-minute walks, hasn't been implemented. The interior spaces, once envisioned with glowing atriums, hanging gardens, and autonomous logistics systems moving goods invisibly through service corridors, currently consist mostly of raw, unfinished shafts and basic service corridors with no indication of when or how they'll be transformed into the livable spaces shown in renderings. The population target for this drastically reduced first phase has dropped to 300,000 residents, and multiple people familiar with the project have privately suggested even that figure is highly optimistic, given construction pace and the complete absence of the infrastructure, transit, utilities, services that would be necessary to actually support that many people. The most telling indicator of the project's troubled status is the disconnect between official communications and observable reality. Saudi Arabian officials continue insisting publicly that the long-term vision for the full 170-kilometer line remains intact and that the current focus on a shorter initial segment is simply phased implementation. But internal documents tell a different story of drastically reduced ambitions, pushed back timelines, and serious questions about whether the full vision will ever be realized. Early promotional renderings still circulating online show the complete 170-kilometer corridor stretching across the horizon in dramatic fashion, but those images no longer reflect the plan that's actually being executed on the ground. The most accurate comparison requires placing those original renderings beside current satellite imagery. One shows an unbroken ribbon of glass and steel cutting through desert, the other shows short, disconnected construction zones struggling to take recognizable form. But even setting aside the dramatic scaling back and the questions about whether construction will meet any of its revised targets, there's a more fundamental question that hasn't been adequately answered. Even if the line were completed exactly as originally envisioned, who would actually want to live there? The concept requires millions of people to embrace a completely unprecedented urban form, living in a narrow corridor with no traditional streets, no to step outside into open air without taking an elevator, no option to own a car or drive anywhere, and total dependence on a single high-speed rail line for all movement beyond walking distance. Would people actually choose that lifestyle? Can a city this centralized, this engineered, this divorced from how humans have organized settlements for millennia actually function as a livable space that attracts residents rather than requiring them? Or is the line ultimately a high-tech monument to an urban planning problem that never actually needed solving? A solution in search of a problem built because it's technologically possible and visually striking rather than because it addresses any genuine human need? Saudi Arabia's broader Vision 2030 includes numerous other mega projects, and many are progressing more successfully than the line, which makes the contrast particularly stark. King Salman Park in Riyadh is under active construction with visible progress. Cranes tower over the site, steel frames for museums are taking shape, foundations are being poured for theaters, landscaping is appearing across large areas. The Muqab, Riyadh's massive cube-shaped structure designed to enclose immersive digital environments, has completed 86% of its excavation work, removing over 10 million cubic meters of earth. Sindalah Island actually opened to tourists in October 2024 with operational marinas, restaurants, golf courses, and luxury hotels under construction. Trojena's ski resort has installed over 1,000 tons of steel for its ski village and confirmed hosting rights for the 2029 Asian Winter Games. These projects are delivering tangible results on realistic timelines. The line, by contrast, has consumed enormous resources while delivering a fragment of its promised vision with no clear path toward completion. The ultimate verdict on the line probably won't be known for years, but the trajectory is increasingly clear. What was announced as revolutionary urban planning has been quietly reduced to an expensive experiment whose practical value remains uncertain. Whether this represents pragmatic adjustment to engineering realities or admission that the original vision was never feasible depends entirely on your perspective. But one thing is undeniable. The gap between what was promised and what's being delivered represents one of the most dramatic scaling back of ambition in modern construction history. The desert is no longer empty. Billions have been spent transforming it, but what's emerging doesn't look much like the future that was sold to the world.